Okay, so it's 11 o'clock, so we will start the seminar. Please keep your video and microphone off. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Dr. Gregory Hadley's seminar on grounded theory method. My name is Hisako Kakai, professor in international communication at School of International Politics, Economics, and Communication at Aoyama Gakuin University in Tokyo. We are so excited about having Dr. Gregory Hadley talk about GTM for us today. As you all know, he is an expert in this qualitative approach. We have about 40 people participating in this seminar today. Despite the time difference, 12 people attend the seminar from the UK. Thank you very much. Before we start, a few announcements. First, we have two sessions today, one in the morning, this one, and the other one in the afternoon. We will have a 45-minute lunch break between these two sessions. So please try to come back by 1:15 Japan Standard Time for the second session if you plan to participate in it. Second, the seminar will be recorded and shared with those who are unable to attend today. I hope it's all right with you. Finally, during the presentation, if you have a question, please send it using a chat function. Okay, now let me briefly introduce you Dr. Hadley's bio. Dr. Hadley is a professor of cultural studies and applied linguistics at Niigata University, Japan. He received his PhD in applied linguistics from the University of Birmingham, UK, where his primary focus was in the sociology of English language education. A visiting fellow at the University of Oxford, he's a contributor to the Sage Handbook of Current Development in Grounded Theory Research, published in 2019. And the author of Grounded Theory in Applied Linguistics Research, a Practical Guide, published in 2017, as well as English for Academic Purposes in Neoliberal Universities, a Critical Grounded Theory, published in 2015. Okay, Dr. Hadley, it's all yours.
Thank you, Dr. Kakai. And everybody, welcome to my study here in Niigata, Japan. I don't think I've ever had 40 people from around the world here in my office before, but thanks for coming to my home for this talk on grounded theory. So if you go to just about anywhere around the world, you'll be hard put not to find someone at a university or a group of scholars somewhere where someone hasn't at least heard of grounded theory. They may not know exactly what it might be, but they've heard of it in one form or another. And it is definitely a world phenomenon. I mean, even as far back as 1998, the qualitative methodologists Norman Denzen and Yvonne Lincoln had stated that at that time, they felt that grounded theory was the most widely employed interpretive strategy in the social sciences today at that time. A couple of years later, a bibliometric study by Titcher et al. Found that for papers that were dealing with aspects of sociological theory, the qualitative ones, their study found that 66% of the papers and book chapters were using some form of grounded theory. And it's been growing since then. Just before starting this talk today, I did a Scopus study on grounded theory publications since 2000, and this is a graph of research papers and book chapters, and you can see that the number of studies that use or at least claim to use the grounded theory methodology just keep increasing year after year. Here's a graph of the areas, the breakdown of disciplines that have an openness to the insight that's gained by grounded theory. You can see that the social sciences, but maybe not all of them, have a large openness to grounded theory studies, as well as medicine and psychology. And then it's evenly spaced between the computer sciences and business and well, management studies, nursing, and the arts and humanities. And I think these are all significant percentages. So it might be a bit of hyperbole, but one could say that the 21st century is becoming the grounded theory century. But despite the wide reach of grounded theory, there are still some major challenges. I mean, depending on your discipline, your grant funding organization, the preferences of what people will say is good research at your university, or the types of studies that can gain access to the prestigious journals in your field, grounded theory can be a problematic subject, and often for good reasons. So, I mean, let me just tell you a very typical story that I've seen several times, and maybe some of you today who are PhD or master's students, supervisors, maybe you've seen something similar. So it kind of starts like this. You have a graduate student, and she isn't sure about how to research her subject, but she's heard about something magical known as grounded theory. And she's heard that she won't have to read a lot of research papers. She can go out into the field right away. The answers are all waiting for her out there. And so she goes and she thinks, well, maybe I should get some books to find out how to do grounded theory. And she goes and she finds some of these books on the methodology. And the explanations are kind of hard to understand. It's really hard to visualize what they're talking about when they talk about coding or creating conceptual categories or looking for a core index. And we're still, I mean, some books will say, do this, always do this, while another book or article will say, no, never do that. Don't ever do that. So you get a question of, what's going on here with this? So after reading a bit and getting an idea that, well, okay, maybe grounded theory is about having some interviews and doing some sort of coding later on. Well, I'll work it out. She'll finally put the books aside. She'll go out into the field and start to code. She'll have some questions and some analysis. We'll do the analysis later. And then if you ask her, well, is this really grounded theory? I mean, it looks like you've got some themes and stuff. She might reply something like, maybe it's not what others would call grounded theory, but I'm calling it grounded theory. And then, well, she decides to go out and continue to get that data. Got to get data, more of it. Well, it seems like that's the safest bet. Let's get some more data. In fact, I'm sure the supervisor will really like this. And so she's out there hearing some things from people that seem to be happening regularly. She's hearing some patterns, but she's still got to get some more data just in case for later analysis. And then suddenly she finds herself covered in interviews, maybe some transcripts, a lot of ideas, but few connections. And she tries to tell her supervisor what she's doing, and the supervisor might ask, well, what's the point? What's the core of this? And it eludes her. She knows it's there, but she just can't seem to touch it. And the supervisor, maybe he or she hasn't done the grounded theory methodology and has only a few ideas about it himself or herself, has no idea what is this student talking about. And time runs out. She can't get it together. The thesis is either unfinished or it's incoherent or it's unconvincing and shallow. And she either finishes with a very low grade thesis or she may even just wash out of the program. Okay, that's not always just the fault of the graduate student. I mean, Maybe her supervisor didn't know about grounded theory either and gave her bad advice. I mean, in my field of applied linguistics, there have been lots of books and things written by experts out there that reveal the confusion about the nature of grounded theory. In my field, there's David Noonan, who said that grounded theory is a type of ethnography, or Ann Burns, who says it's a type of action research, or Kanagaraja, who just uses grounded theory as a kind of a trendy catchphrase in the foreword of his book. And then there are others who have written some excellent books and papers on methodology, and they've discussed grounded theory, but they themselves, at least at the time of their writing, have never actually done it themselves. And I'm not sure about your field, but definitely within the field of applied linguistics, there's a deeper problem, and something that I'm going to discuss later, which is what I call the problem of process thinking. It's the idea that somehow if you can just find the steps of how to do a certain process, how the different steps for doing a grounded theory methodology, then the theory will come out like prepackaged sausages. All you have to do is just find out the way to do it, and the theory will attend to itself. This sausage making approach to research is very common in applied linguistics, and it's something that, unfortunately, while we won't talk about it too much in these sessions, for the later sessions in this longer course, it's something that I really think that we need to address. But I wanted to put it out there for you. Are you looking for a sausage making approach, or are you looking for something that's going to require you to go really deep inside yourself, and what you know, and how open are you, and how sensitive are you to the people that you are doing research with? It's an important aspect of grounded theory. So because of these different problems and issues, the result is often that with methodological mistakes, a lack of rapport among the gatekeeper academics, some misunderstandings about how to actually carry out the methodology, you get the experience of some form of rejection. I mean, for the academic who has perhaps actually done grounded theory and has developed something that may be of some interest, they have a solid theory, but then they send it off to an editor or the reviewers who don't know anything about the method. If the findings are novel, but they don't know about qualitative research, and like a Dalek from Doctor Who, they're saying, this is strange, reject, because it's just not what I'm used to seeing. What is this all about? And these dynamics also stand behind why so many graduate supervisors will discourage their students from using grounded theory. They don't understand it. And they've seen other students perhaps try to do it and have made a mess of things in the process. It's best to avoid it. Try something else, thematic analysis, or, well, do a statistical study. It'll be easier for both of us. Well, in these lectures, what I want to do is I want to try and maybe set the record straight at least a little bit. In the first of these two 90-minute, hopefully 90-minute sessions, I'd like to do the following. I'd like to study the origins and some of the early controversies surrounding the grounded theory methodology. And I want to address some of the critiques of GTM, because there's some good ones out there and we need to think about that. I'll then give you an overview of the stages and the procedures that are used in what's, say, a plain vanilla version of grounded theory. We'll think about how to evaluate and to communicate the results of your grounded theory work. And later on in the next series or next lecture after lunchtime, we'll want to learn about the different types of grounded theory methodologies that are available to you as researchers or graduate students. But above all, what I want to do is I want to help make grounded theory a little more accessible to you, either as supervisors, researchers, and graduate students. I want to do my part in fighting what I've called methodological malpractice. The situation where you have someone that's out there doing something that they say is the grounded theory methodology, doing it wrong, making a mess of things, or developing something that's not too impressive, and then calling it grounded theory, and then giving the methodology a bad name. And I'd like to try to help in some small way to try to ameliorate those sorts of concerns. And for graduate students, I want to help you to get a handle on your data. I want you to know the principles of pacing yourself so that you won't get overwhelmed by your data and drowned in all of this paperwork and not actually go forward. So here we go. We're going to go on now to the early origins and methodology of grounded theory, but at the onset, I do think it's important first to sort of clarify the methodology. You see, one of the problems, especially in the older texts on the subject, is that grounded theory sometimes refers to a theory, a sociological theory. And sometimes it refers to a set of procedures. And this can be confusing to somebody. You know, is it a grounded theory? Are you doing grounded theory? And the fact of the matter is that yes, the term does refer to both a product and a process. And in terms of it being a product, the founders of grounded theory, Barney Glaser and Anselm Strauss, describe a grounded theory as something that fits empirical situations, one that should be understandable to sociologists and laymen alike. More important, it works. It provides us with relevant predictions, explanations, interpretations, and applications. This is a very pragmatic view of theory, and I'd like you to remember that as we look a little bit later to some of the philosophical underpinnings of grounded theory. So it fits, it works, it explains, and a good grounded theory should, if after reading about what people do in certain situations, should help you to go into a new environment where you see some of this behavior and activity going on. You think, I remember about what that, I've seen that, I've read about that. Okay, now I've got a fairly good idea about what's going to happen next. Or if this doesn't happen, what's something else that might happen? Or what should I do in this situation to deal with what's going on around you? Grounded theories are mid-range theories about certain social arenas, certain areas of human activity that kind of bring to the fore things that were always happening but you weren't aware of. It's a very interesting area of sociological research. Okay, so that's grounded theory in terms of being a product. But in terms of procedures, then grounded theory refers to the methodology for making a grounded theory. Okay, and this is often described now by a number of scholars as referring to the methodology. They use the term GTM these days. And that's what I'm going to try to do as well. I'll try to refer to the methodology as GTM. I mean, it isn't a perfect solution, but it helps. And sometimes, because I've read a lot of the older literature, sometimes I say grounded theory when I'm referring to the methodology as well, but I try these days to focus on GTM, and I hope you will too. Okay, so that's some of the the nomenclature that I wanted to get out of the way right at the beginning. Let's now look at some of the roots of GTM. And first, I want to look at some of the underlying philosophical ideas, the underpinning philosophies that kind of run as the software for the methodology. So grounded theory's methodology has deep roots in the philosophy that's known as American pragmatism. I mean, some of the notable people of the 19th and 20th century philosophers and scholars from this school are people such as Charles Peirce, George Herbert Mead, William James, John Dewey, among others. And it's a complex, well, most philosophies are complex, but to be maybe simplistic to the point of almost being inaccurate, American pragmatism focuses on action and what people do. And for American pragmatists, things that are true are things that are useful. I'll let you chew on that for a few seconds. What they mean is that if something is useful, truly useful, then it's connected to truth. But if something that people are doing or a society is doing eventually causes that society to fall apart or to cause huge problems, it's not useful. It's also flawed. It's not true either. And this notion of truth is connected to action. Things that are true endure. Things that are useful endure. If not useful, they end up being put into the dustbin of history and discarded. And they also study human interactions, or the symbols that people create in their societies, whether it's a flag or a certain statue or whatever it is, these various symbols that people have in their lives that give them identity and give them meaning. They look at how people create these symbols, both physical and also through words. They spend a lot of time studying discourse, human discourse. They see reality as essentially chaotic and provisional, but that people structure this chaotic reality in social groups through the things they say and the things that they do, and through their actions. And in terms of theory, William James describes pragmatic theory in these terms. It's designed for the purpose of solving problems, facilitating action, and stimulating deeper understanding about a certain situation or issue. So I think you can see that this clearly has strong roots with the way that Glaser and Strauss had structured their idea of grounded theory. Okay, anyway, American pragmatism, that's one important aspect, a very important aspect of the grounded theory methodology. Another ingredient that goes into grounded theory is that of empirical sociology. Especially the empirical sociologists from Columbia University in the 1950s. I'm thinking chief among these for our discussion, the sociologists Robert Merton and Paul Lazarsfeld. Now, Lazarsfeld worked with big data, but he also suggested using mathematics, ways of condensing qualitative data into concepts or core indices. And Robert Merton, who, by the way, was the person who coined the term self-fulfilling prophecy, he focused on making mid-level theories, not these huge overarching theories about everything in human society, but looking for specific areas of human activity and making theories about what people do in these situations, and then trying to find ways to apply them to other social arenas. One of the founders of grounded theory, Barney Glaser, was a student of these sociologists. Merton supervised Glaser's PhD work, and Glaser learned a lot from Merton's ability to make interesting phrases for summarizing human activity. But Glaser also said that Merton had a dark side. He writes how Merton would prepare his theoretical ideas from his chair, in his office. And then Merton would take his theoretical ideas and he'd send his PhD students out into the field with his ideas, with codes and concepts that he had created. And these PhD students would then take his ideas and they'd run out into the field and they'd try to find ways to validate his theoretical data. Glaser said that he saw a lot of good PhD students lose their careers. They washed out because as much as they tried to validate Merton's theories, he couldn't, because they didn't fit with what was going on out in the field. And so when Glaser seeing that actually had a huge effect on him as a later researcher. And that's one of the reasons why grounded theory doesn't call for you to develop codes and ideas and concepts before going into the field. You go out and you find out what's happening and you develop concepts, codes, activities from what you encounter out in the field. And it came from Barney Glaser's experience of working with Merton. Okay, now another important influence in the development of grounded theory was from the sociologist Herbert Bloomer, who developed a sociological perspective known as symbolic interactionism. Now, let me tell you a little bit about that. Bloomer's ideas were influenced by his association with the American pragmatist and social psychologist George Herbert Mead. And symbolic interactionism states some of these key points. These are just some of the key points of what it states. That people are able to think, that they can think rationally and cognitively, that they're not stupid. They have good reasons for why they think the way they do and do the things that they do, but that their thinking is often shaped by the interactions that they have with other people. So the thinking and the good reasons, or the reasons for why they do things, come out of a community, whether they've been raised in perhaps a conservative Muslim community in Pakistan, or a conservative evangelical community in the Midwest, or if they've been raised in an intellectual East Coast environment. Their thinking is shaped by the interactions that they've had over the years with other people in their communities. And these different groups of people have symbols and things that these can be words or things that can be seen that help them to remember who they are, what they're about, and how to carry out their social life. And the symbols and the meanings will also change based on social context. And the symbols can mean different things to different people. Symbolic interactionists would be very interested in studying the role of statues, historic statues right now in various countries, based on the different communities that approach those symbols very, very differently. And the symbolic interactionism also says that with this thinking, interacting with language and creating meaning, that there's a constant interplay between this, and that as language changes and meanings change, thinking also can change within groups over time, and especially with their interactions with other groups. And something that's also important to know is that the way that symbolic interactionists would find out about these things is by going out into the field and interviewing people. Very much of a Chicago school sociology approach of going out and finding what's happening to with people actually out there. Bloomer also advocated, looking at things like newspaper articles, posters on the wall, anything around that might tell you a message of what might be going on in a situation. Anyway, all of this work with symbolic interactionism was very, very influential on Anselm Strauss, who was also the other founder, creator of grounded theory. So we can see then that from the Columbia University, Chicago school sociologists, American pragmatists, Bloomer's symbolic interactionism, all of this went into the creation of the grounded theory methodology. But then there's also another element that we just can't overlook. It was the 1960s, and it was a time when there were new ideas and new challenges to the status quo. There were ideas like constructivism and social constructivism, feminism, all sorts of isms that were entering into research. It was a time to undercut authority. It was a time to stick it to the man and give power to the people. And grounded theory is definitely part of this zeitgeist. Okay, so with those sort of roots, let's now move over now to some of the early beginnings of how things got started. So Anselm Strauss was hired to set up a sociology curriculum at the University of California, San Francisco. He was working in the nursing department, and they also gave him a free hand to hire or to invite in people to help teach in this sociology department. He knew Barney Glaser and invited him to come on to the staff, as well as other people such as Leonard Schatzman and a few others that he had known from his time at the University of Chicago. And so during the time that they started up doing this program, both Anselm Strauss and Barney Glaser had elderly parents, and they were at the same time both really ill and with terminal illnesses, actually. Both of their parents were in hospitals, and nobody was saying anything, but everybody was thinking, this is the beginning of the end. I suppose perhaps in one way to kind of deal with the emotions of losing their parents and all of the memories, good and bad, that come out of that, the things that people say and wish they could say, they put it in, they decided to approach it as sociologists. And so they began to actually team together and to do a sociological study of what happens in hospitals when somebody's dying. What do the doctors do? What do the nurses do? What do the patients do? What do the family do? What are the things that are said and what are the things that are happening? And as a result of this study, which of course they were very, very intimately connected to, they published a book called Awareness of Dying. And even today, it's one of the landmark books in medical sociology on what happens in hospitals when people are dying. And as an aside, when I was beginning to consider grounded theory, I got this book because this is the first book that was created out of using the grounded theory methodology. And it happened that my own father-in-law had terminal cancer in the hospital. And a lot of the things that I read in this book helped me to understand and see what was going on in a Japanese hospital that, over 50 years later after the publication of this book, it was touching upon real human social interactions that in some ways sort of transcend what we see sometimes as culture. When I saw that this theory that they had developed was powerful enough to help me to get a better understanding of what was happening with my own father-in-law, I thought, hey, maybe there is something to this grounded theory methodology after all. And other people at the same time thought the same thing. They wondered, how did these two methodologists, two sociologists who weren't doctors or nurses, how did they get it so well? And so as a response to that, they then wrote their book, The Discovery of Grounded Theory, to explain what it was that they did and why they did it the way they did. This book, The Discovery of Grounded Theory, put them on the map. And it was a radical manifesto for the time because it rejected the idea of great man theories. And it was the time they didn't use inclusive language, but they were rejecting the idea of these philosophers and sociologists who sat in their study and made theories and then wrote books about it. I suppose Glaser was probably thinking a lot about Merton when this was written. But they were calling now for theories that were developed from the field research and built from the ground up. It was a flipped version of sociological research. So they continued to teach at the University of California, San Francisco, and they began more and more to introduce their book on grounded theory into their classes and to introduce GTM to their students. But the thing is that this book was written for sociologists, people already out there, probably faculty at universities and such. And it wasn't intended for graduate students. So they had a lot of questions about what does this mean and what does that mean? And when they get answers, for example, this is, well, what do you mean by coding the data? They get something like, from Glaser in his class, he'd say something like this: well, coding reflects the empirical reality. And then they go into Strauss's classes, what are you saying? He says, oh, well, coding it's based on reality, but you got to know social reality, it emerges from constantly changing social interactions. So, it's rather provisional. So students began to get the idea, and Kathy Sharmez had told me this a number of times when she was in classes with them, that everybody knew these guys, they wrote this book, but they had very different ideas about what they thought they were talking about when they said grounded theory. And this was eventually going to lead to conflict that was going to distract many and slow down grounded theory development for many years. Let me tell you a little bit about that story. Okay, Glaser was passed over for tenure. It's a long story, and you can find out stuff by reading oral histories with Leonard Schatzman and others to find the details. But at any rate, he went out and started his own private grounded theory institute. Strauss stayed in academia. And in 1987, he wrote this book, Qualitative Analysis for Social Scientists. And it was very similar to a self-published book that Glaser wrote 9 years earlier. And I'll tell you more about that later. In fact, this book, he had permission from Glaser to borrow vast sections of Glaser's book. And Glaser said, okay. Now, Strauss presents some very different procedures for coding and forms of analysis, but you know, it was still pretty much the same thing that he and Glaser had done back in the 60s. And so Glaser says, yeah, this is good stuff. Like it, love it, love what I see, love what I see. However, a few years later, Strauss, based on this book, invited one of his former graduate students, Juliet Corbin, to work with him on another book, The Basics of Qualitative Research. And this was like the 1987 book, but it was more evolved. It was more clearly distinct from Glaser's version. Glaser was, you know, looking at this book that they did, and he was really unhappy about it. In fact, he even tried to keep the book from being published. And, you know, he came up with all sorts of things. It's like, what have you done? You know, you've done this without me. It's not like before. And who is she? What's she doing here? And behind the scenes, all of this was going on. Strauss wrote in the foreword of the book that grounded theory evolves. You know, he said basically to Glaser, he says, look, you know, grounded theory is constantly evolving. It's based upon the way he sees things, how Strauss saw things. Things are constantly in a state of flux and growing and evolving and changing. So the book went out in print, and Glaser, he just went ballistic. He through his Sociology Press, that his self-publishing business, he created this book called The Basics of Grounded Theory Analysis. It's got a lot of good stuff in it, actually. You know, I found it, some parts of it really helpful. But he does basically, like in the form of a medieval pamphleteer, goes line by line, basically everything that he finds wrong in Strauss and Corbin's book, and writes what should be the right way. And a lot of it's helpful, but a lot of it had some seriously hurtful things as well. It brings us to a point that's called maybe the basics of grounded theory analysis, a scandal. He wrote some pretty hurtful things there. I will quote directly from his book, where I suppose in a fit of artistic pique, he takes on almost like a godlike status, speaking from the throne, as he refers to himself as the originator. Here's how it goes, like this. Yeah. So he starts. These are all direct quotes with the typos as well. I am not a neutral third party just writing a critique. I am one of the originators, with the right to keep my product on course for its users. Anselm loves me, but he never understood me. Anselm's presented innocence is astounding. It totally blankets his guilt, his exploitativeness, and his immorality. He does not get it. Julie Corbin presents a clear issue with respect to intellectual property. She is a third party that came along later. She co-authored as book as if she was another co-originator, a clearly immoral act. She mooched in as a co-originator, which she is not. Unlike Anselm, she is not a scholar. She knows no better. So it goes on kind of like this, and it's like, okay, you know, such are the dangers of self-publishing, I suppose. And you know, in the world of social media today, you know, sometimes people write things and say things, yeah. But we've seen worse in social media. But my reading of Glaser is that, from what I've learned from those who know him, is that he's a genius with an artistic temperament. And so things like this can be said. But it also helps us, I think, to appreciate how peer review can really help to moderate one's excesses and to seek to be our best selves in an academic community. We need to be accountable, you know, otherwise any of us could get corrupted. Well, anyway, moving on. The result of this is that there were several years where the fans of Glaser and and admirers of Strauss went at each other in a kind of pamphlet war over who had the true version of grounded theory methodology. And a lot of energy that could have been better spent directed towards helping people on how to do the methodology was actually lost. Actually, a more recent book by Barry Gibson and Jan Hartman states that underpinning this problem at the time was that they had fundamentally different paradigmatic beliefs. This is the result when you have large numbers of us out there carrying out research without an awareness of the beliefs that guide our decisions. And in later sessions with the graduate students in this program, unfortunately not the public ones, we're going to go deep into philosophy to help them understand why they believe what they believe and what sort of grounded theory methodology might be best fitted for the way that they view things and would like to do things. Okay, anyway, we've had all this turmoil going on, and it's like, meanwhile, back at the ranch, there were external critiques emerging about grounded theory methodology. Some of these were about the terms of issues of terminological confusion, like I had stated earlier. Is it a grounded theory? Is it doing grounded theory? But there were, you know, things like what's a category, what's a code, what's a substantive code. You know, all sorts of terminology and very confusing for people. And some thought, you know, it's like, well, don't you just know what you need to do? Why do you have to break down all the codes and write the memos and do all of this sort of stuff? I mean, can't you do it a little bit more easily? And especially with Glaser's work, there seemed to be like almost an overemphasis on inductive thinking, that there seemed to be no aspect of deduction, that things seemed to be based almost to a fault about what seemed to be going on out in the field. And some people found that to be problematic. There was also the point that, especially in Glaser's version of grounded theory, that he said up front, don't read the scholarly literature before you go out into the field. You need to go in with your mind sort of clear of bias. And what did this actually mean? Was this actually a good idea? And then there were other issues related to the point of what's going down with the critical issues of critical awareness. Okay, now a lot of these, there's some good points here, but you know, I would respond that a lot of the criticism that you'll find even today on grounded theory comes from a reading of The Discovery of Grounded Theory, which, you know, had its good points, but there were lots of ambiguous places there and weak points that could have been shored up and have been shored up actually in later books. Other versions, more modern versions of GTM, have looked at some of the shortcomings or the holes, so to speak, and have, in my opinion at least, have evolved and improved. And you'll find that that some people still think that GTM relies on induction, but if you read more deeply into the more modern literature, grounded theory is based on a notion from American pragmatism called abduction. It's kind of a complex thought, but basically what abduction means that you make inductive thoughts about what you know is possible. To give you an idea, I mean, if you go outside into your garden, if you have one, and it's the morning and there's lots of water all over the plants, you could say, oh, well, maybe there's water there, so maybe there's dew out there. But you might say, oh, maybe somebody watered my plants. Or you might say, well, Maybe they're aliens that did it. You know, there's always aliens without any other explanation. It's always aliens, right? Abduction would say, what's really possible? What's most likely to be possible in this situation? And you work from that. So grounded theory works from that sort of space of thinking, not just anything goes in terms of induction. And critical grounded theory is something that is currently in development, and I'll talk a little bit more about my take on that later. Well, anyway, with the issue between Glaser and Strauss and this people, you know, eventually things did calm down, and people realized that they should spend a lot more time looking at what they had in common and not fighting each other, because it was a bit embarrassing, actually, if you want to, you know, the family argument, the laundry out in public and such. I think one of the best sort of conciliatory tones that I've seen in recent years is from this book that was a chapter in this book by Echevarria, Doan, and Carolyn Tubbs. And they stated that Glaser and Strauss both made major contributions, and it's not a case of either or, but both and. And I think that's a really helpful position to take, so long as you have made an informed choice. Okay, let's move over now to looking at aspects of the methodology, of grounded theory methodology. And what I'm going to do is try to describe what I hope to be a plain vanilla form of the methodology, which was sort of contrasted with what many of us do in other research projects. I mean, with other research projects, here we often have a theory beforehand, do the readings, and then do a research method that will validate the findings. That's the way I was raised with doing research for most of my life, and a lot of graduate students and researchers do that today. And there's nothing wrong with this at all. But as I've said, grounded theory is a flipped version of research, where you start out with a very open-ended exploration time called open exploration. And over time, you begin to focus the ideas on what's going on in the area of research. This will lead you to look for scholarly readings that actually relate to what you're encountering in the field. And then with an interaction between the people in the field, the scholarly readings, you over time begin to develop a theory about what's going on. And by and large, this is the way that grounded theory approaches things. It begins primarily with a broad sense of curiosity. It's not a case of you going and saying, I want to understand about this, this, and this, and this, and this per se. It's broader, it's more open-ended. It's like when you're a teacher and you enter into a class and students are doing something and you think, huh? You know, what is this? You know, what's going on here? That's a basic question that guides the grounded theory methodology. And by what's going on here, I mean, what are people doing? What are people saying? What are the actions or ideas that people are taking for granted? And even more important, what are the common problems that people are encountering? And there's also the thing that when I say actions and ideas that people are taking for granted, they may not really talk about these things. Those are things that they would think, well, everybody knows that, but maybe no one does that except people in that group. That may be of something of great value to communicate to other people. So these questions, like I say, underwrite the various levels of inquiry, where the focus is on activity, it's on interaction, and it's on movement. Okay, so let's look a little bit at open exploration now. And there are various activities or various practices that will go on with this. Open sampling is the issue of where you are going to go into a certain area. Let's say someone was in the earlier session that started before this, is studying international students or a certain group of international students. You would not just say, I'm going to speak to female international students or male international students, or you would talk to everyone connected to the international student situation. The students, the people in the university who work with them. You might want to talk even with the people who work for the organizations that send them. You'll talk with anybody that will have something to do with the general phenomenon around the international students. Now, repertory grids is something that I've written about here and there, and I don't have time to talk about it in this session. But if you're interested in contact me, I can send you some papers on it later. Well, it's a great technique for when you don't know what's going on. You actually have a person have an internal interview with themselves. They write out things in the forms of constructs and elements, empirical things and actions, and then they rate them. You can put this through a computer analysis and actually get a graph of beliefs that are around certain actions that they see. It helps you cut weeks, if not months, off of the interview process on things. But again, we can't go into that. A lot of people are much more comfortable with doing exploratory interviews, where you start out with questions like, what's a good day for you here? What are some of the major problems that you're facing? What's a bad day for you? What are the things that you like doing the most? Questions like this to find out the overall structure and issues that are going on. The problems that they're encountering on a common basis. What are the solutions that they are trying to find around those problems? You start out, though, instead of starting out with interviews, you usually start out with observation first and write down field notes of what you're seeing, which helps you to ask questions. And then you write memos, and I'll talk about some of these in greater detail. This would be in open coding, sort of the process of the very beginning with what you would you start with one data collection event. Let's say it's an interview or an observation. You do that, and if it's an interview, you maybe right away you write a summary of what you talked about. Hopefully you're able to have permission to record the interview, but you go ahead and write a summary. And then you would code that summary. Later on, when you get back to your home or your room, you'd make a transcript of the interview. And you look at the codes in your summary, you'd put those into the interview, but you'd also add more codes to that as well. And then in the process of doing that, you're going to write some memos, some good ideas, maybe some speculative thoughts about what seems to be happening in this interview. And then you maybe want to explain what a certain code seems to mean to you. And then you jot down, based on this interview, what are some new questions? What are some further things that you would like to ask? Something else that will drive you back out into the field, where you will speak to or observe another person or another group. And you'll do the same process again, although you will use any of the open codes you made from the first event in this one, if they fit, and add new ones. And then you would continue that process, several times. Okay, so talking about coding a lot, and sometimes you say, well, what is coding? Let me try to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. Think about this. Let's say you go to a great library and you find some ancient manuscript, right? And you will have noticed that in many of these manuscripts, sometimes people will have actually either at the time this manuscript was made or in later copies, they'll have certain little explanations or summaries written on the side in the margins. For example, if you see an old King James Bible, authoritative version of the Bible, you'll see that there. You'll see little chapter headings and such. These types of things are actually codes. Let me give you another example. This is a manuscript that Christopher Columbus had before he went out to search for the New World. And he was reading it about what some sailors and some travelers had found in certain areas of the ocean. And you can see on the side that he has written notes summarizing what he was reading there. There's even a few small pictures and graphs of ideas that have come to his mind. But what I want to say is that this is a type of open coding, and this type of analysis, together with the critical thought and the idea of going out in the field, have been in Western thought, Western research for a very long time. There's not much that's really new about grounded theory that you can't find, in Socrates or even Herodotus, the father of history. Okay, here's an observation log. with an example of codes. And again, this is a paper version of this. It hasn't been done on a computer. And you can see how this person has underlined sections of what he or she had seen, and put a little number next to it, and then gave it a code. Now, you'll notice that the codes at this stage for open coding is very descriptive. It's not a case of, judging what you think is going on. For example, if you have students who in this observation log, let's see if we can look down, look at number 22. It says only 3 students had work. I suppose it should have had worked with the materials, but none of them finished the worksheets. Yes, some might have said incorrectly at this point, oh, the students are demotivated, or students are lazy. You don't judge what's going on in this. What you do at this stage is you simply, at this point, break it up, describe the activities that's going on, things that you and I can see. So if a student's sleeping in a class, you don't say, oh, the student's demotivated. You say, well, the student is sleeping in the class. It's up to us later on, if this is a common thing, to find out causes and reasons much later on. So there are various levels of coding. I've spoken about open coding, but then later on, there's a version of coding where things come together with the open codes called substantive coding or focused coding. And there's a higher level code that connects concepts called theoretical coding. All of these go into the creation of a grounded theory. Now, a grounded theory is not just a bunch of codes, but codes are used to make grounded theory. And that's an important distinction to make. And although I've showed this as different stages, the reality is that it sort of takes place like this. You're going to make open codes, and then later on you'll be making focused codes, but you might find that you'll have to go back and change something that you've made earlier because it needs to have a better fit with what's really happening from your viewpoint in the field. And so these things kind of, the further on you go on in the project, the more and more that these things all become sort of a simultaneous action. All right, so I've spoken now about coding, but now I need to speak a little more about memos, because memos are more important, or at least equally as important as coding, because writing memos is where you begin to make sense of your codes. You begin to reconstruct your data into something plausible and coherent. You're trying to develop an explanation of what is going on in the social arena that you are studying. So here's an issue that you'll find with graduate students. They've got a lot of codes. They may have even been able to consolidate them into focused codes, and they might even have some theoretical codes with concepts. They don't have any memos. Without memos, you don't have a grounded theory. You cannot do grounded theory without a large number of memos that explain what's going on, that delve deeper, and that to drive you further into investigating what's going on. And throughout this process, you need to make sure that you're constantly looking for future action. What are you going to do for the next step? How does this memo, how does understanding this code help you to ask new questions? Or maybe you realize you don't know enough about this. You need to find out more. It's constantly driving you forward to the next event of collecting data and analyzing it. And yet throughout this process, you need to engage in what Glaser and Strauss called constant comparison, which is essentially a form of Socratic thinking. When you're creating these memos and these codes, yeah, you need to think about, okay, what sort of things seem to be similar? The people are saying things that seem to, this person said this and this, that seems to be really, really similar. And that's working with codes, and I'm seeing some regular patterns. Aha, your brain likes to make patterns because it wants to relax from having to think too hard. So it want to fixate on that. You also need to look at what's different, what's different from these patterns. And I'm starting to develop an idea of a theory of this seems to be happening a lot. Look for the times and ask people to tell you but when your ideas are not working or when they don't fit, because that will define the edges of your theory and the limitations of what you're seeing. Okay, so this process is carried out one piece of data at a time, and you carry your insights over. You're going out, you're looking for next piece of data, not the same questions, but each time going forward with increased focus and insight. Now, you're about to, after about maybe 5 to 10 interviews, if you've been doing this process of squeezing everything possible out of the interviews, you're probably ready to move on to a more focused investigation. And in this case, you're going to engage in what's called theoretical sampling. Now, theoretical sampling is not looking for certain types of people. This is a strange sort of thing. I'm going to try to get this. You develop certain codes. You group together various open codes into small groupings. You give them a new label. You've written a memo about how these open codes contribute to this label, a focused code. Then you start looking now for places where you can find out more about these focused codes and maybe certain types of people in certain situations, but you're not looking for the people, you're looking for information about the codes, the general human activity that's happening there. That's what theoretical sampling means. And at this point, the focused codes and what's happening in that area, that's going to give you an idea now about what sort of scholarly literature you need to start accessing. See, for Glaser and Strauss, and for the sociologists that they first had written to, they'd already read a lot of things. They were well versed in their field, and so there was an idea to get them away from their biases before they go out in the field. For graduate students now, yeah, okay, they might read something during open exploration and then try to prove that in their interviews. Well, that's probably not so good. But now with focused investigation, now they've got some questions about certain specific things and issues and problems. Now they can start talking to the PhD supervisor or the MA supervisor, checking out Google Scholar, going to the library to find out what other researchers are saying about the issues that they seem to be encountering in the field. And memos continue to be a process throughout this time. In fact, the scholarly literature is treated like another research informant. You should code the scholarly literature that you read and to find out how it fits and how it further explains the different codes that you have. Let me give you an example of what it looks like. Here's an interview that had been open coded. And you don't have time to read all of that, but you can see that there's a lot of codes that have been developed from this, right? So after focused coding, it looks like this. Okay, now, again, inside these focused codes are several open codes. They're there, and you have memos that will have defined what these mean, how the role of the open codes in the formation of these focused codes. They're still in there, but you'll see that later transcripts as you go further on are going to be using the focused codes, not more and more open codes. You're moving now more and more towards using a limited amount of codes to look for issues in your data. And again, these focused codes will tell you exactly what you need to do in terms of scholarly literature to help unpack your data. All right, so with that, you start to develop then, ideas with later memos, where you start to graph things out, to diagram the way that the different conditions and consequences and covariances that take place within the data is actually interacting with your theoretical thoughts and the literature and what you're getting from your interviews. And your memos will become much more complex. And these types of memos are not just simply for your own use. They're actually writing your thesis or your book or your research paper as you make these memos. I'll show in later sessions to the students later this week how bits and pieces of my memos actually go in to published work. This is the part of grounded theory that's kind of nice, is once you're in the middle of the analysis, you're actually writing drafts of your research paper as you actually do the research. Okay, so a question then might be like, all right, I'm already tired hearing about this, Greg. I mean, how much longer are we going to keep going with this type of thing? When is enough? When is enough is enough? Well, one writer by the name of Ian Day has a nice concept called theoretical sufficiency. And I like this over Glaser and Strauss's idea of theoretical saturation. But they mean basically the same thing. What is this? Is that when you get to a place in your research where you're talking to people, you're encountering scholarly literature, and you're going around and working, doing the process of grounded theory, and you're finding that you're working harder and harder to find something new. And the things that you find that are new are like, hey, that's really interesting. But if you hadn't found out that piece of information, it wouldn't have affected the overall value of your theory. It's nice to have, but it took a lot of work to find it. When you find that you're getting in that sort of stage, then it's probably okay now to stop collecting data and continue work at refining and writing up your grounded theory. Okay, but if you want a hard number, John Cresswell has done some interesting things with, he's a brilliant man, really great in mathematics, and he does great in qualitative and quantitative and mixed methods research. And he's written in this book that basically between 20 to 60 participants that you've interviewed, you should have more than enough to develop your grounded theory. Actually, I've been in private conversations with him over the past few months, and he thinks that really 30 is the number that you'll probably, if you're going over 30 participants interviews, you probably have too much. And from my own experience of doing the grounded theory methodology, I really think he's right. I've done certain studies where I've spoken close to 100 people, something that Kathy Sharmaz would advocate, but it was really too much, I think. I think that this is probably, in my opinion, a healthy number. All right, so here we go. I've spoken about all this, the open sampling, the interviews, the coding, the memos, the theoretical sampling, the focused coding, working up to developing from that conceptual categories, connecting those categories with coding, follow-up interviews, more theoretical memos, maybe more scholarly literature. All of this is going back and forth and back and forth. And finally, ta-da, you get a grounded theory. Yay, right? Okay. Feel good? Yeah, well, somebody's going to come up and say this. All right, hey, so how can we know that your grounded theory is not simply just a complicated version of bias confirmation? It's a good question. I mean, might be out there, you've got all the things, you've worked it out, it seems to be really, really plausible, but hey, it's wrong. You were looking at something, but it wasn't the real thing. So what do you answer this? Well, this sort of thing will certainly happen if you do not do the constant comparison, especially constant comparison in what would be called, in grounded theory language, an iterative framework. Time and time again, over and over again, you need to spend time trying to break your own theory. When you get that moment of, it makes sense, it just, here we go. That's the moment when you're in your greatest bit of danger, because your brain wants to, say, solidify, doesn't want to keep burning up so much calories trying to figure out to structure this thought. This works. You get a dopamine rush. You don't want to go any further. No, you have to go further just at that moment, because if you don't find the weaknesses, the limitations, if you don't try to break your theory, somebody else will, and it will be kind of a sad moment for you. You don't want that to happen. Another thing to remember is that depending upon your understanding of your philosophical background, Kathy Sharmaz says that it's a grounded theory, not hard facts. And that means that it's a plausible explanation of what's going on. Now, that doesn't mean that it's false. It means that the theory, as she would say, is something that's been constructed from the data. It's not made up, but it's a construction. What do I mean by that? Because you always run into somebody at a party or something with a pipe and says, "Oh, it's all a construction," and walks away, and it doesn't mean anything, does it? Well, think of it kind of like this. You're walking along a port, a fishing port. The fishermen are out there, fishers are doing their thing, and there's a net sitting next to you. And you pick up that net in one clump and you pull it up. You've got some of it there right in your hand. Okay, think of this net symbolically as the interconnected humans society that you've been studying, right? And all the different ideas and thoughts and concepts and interactions that are going on with them. In your grounded theory, you've picked up a very important piece of that and you've lifted it up, and you show, okay, you're showing people, here's this, and it spreads, out to lower levels of things that are, less, maybe, that are connected, but less obvious in some way. Now, another person who would come along as a researcher with a different position and perspective may pick up another part of that net. And some of the things that you'll find in the focused investigation, the open exploration, they're going to be similar because they are connected. But there's going to be something else that they're going to pull up and show. It doesn't mean that your theory is wrong. It's a certain perspective of what's happening in that area. And if it works for the people that you're describing, if they come back and say that makes sense, then you're probably on the right track. Now, what I mean is this: is that Kathy Sharma has had a really good system for grounded theory evaluation. First of all, it's American pragmatism here right now. Is it useful? At the end of the day, does the theory help people in planning what to do for the future? Can they get an idea about, oh, this looks like this might be happening? Does it help them have some sense of control over the situation? Have you as a theorist been open about what you did as your methodology, how you presented your data, some of the problems that you may have had, how you worked around things? Is the literature, does it fit with what's going on? Is the theoretical discussion believable? And then the next one is that of resonance. Does the theory ring true? And as I had just said with the earlier slide, the way you can find out about that is you go back out and you find people in your area of study and you present aspects of your theory, or maybe you by text, by messenger or something, you can send them some graphs and pictures and explain, this is what I think I'm seeing in the area of field. And you wait, and if they do something like, I never thought of that before, but it's always been there. I can see it. Wow, yes, that makes total sense. If someone from that area that you're studying, and more and more people are saying that to you, okay, you've got your grounded theory and it's working for them and it's going to be helpful for them. Originality can also be, it can be like, okay, this is something we've never thought of before. Oh, it was always there, but we never saw it. But it might be a case that you will find out that aspects of your theory connect to things that other people have also seen. It doesn't denigrate your work. You're going to have some new perspectives and some new things to add to that. So you can add to previous works and extend the knowledge or the theorization in a certain area. And you will oftentimes provide a fresh perspective, especially if you're looking for scholarly literature that may not be in your particular field, but has really clear and helpful explanations for what's happening in your field. Okay, so writing up a grounded theory as we get closer to wrapping up. It depends on who you're writing to and what you're writing, but you will definitely have to, perhaps if you're going to do a small paper or presentation, you can only present maybe a focused code and some of the open code quotes. When it comes to maybe a book chapter, and then you could probably report on a category in some of the focus codes, the core category and larger categories and focus codes. Something like that is more like for a PhD thesis or for a book. But when you report a grounded theory, you still have to remember the rules and the mores for your discipline. I mean, for example, let me tell you from my background of applied linguistics. This is a researcher by the name of Philip Durant. He studied the nature of applied linguistics scholarly writing. And he found out that in scholarly writing, these are some things that you have to do. You know, you need to use some sort of abstract idea, this would be theoretical ideas, as a point of departure, for something maybe more pragmatic or practical. You look at people as free agents that are in some sort of uncontrollable and complex environment that fits with American pragmatism. You know, these are things that are of key importance to applied linguists. If you're writing for psychology, if you're writing for cultural studies, these may be very different, but you need to find out what they are so that you can contextualize your grounded theory so that it can communicate to your academic community. Okay, let's wrap up. Grounded theory is not magic. You know, it's a bit of hard work. But let me tell you, grounded theory is, you know, as a term used to describe either the methodology or the end product. It's an exploratory form of research. It's not for verifying, it's for exploring. And although I haven't gone into this in great detail, you can use qualitative and quantitative research in a grounded theory. I wish I had had more time to talk about that, but we just don't have the time. It's a disciplined thing. You don't just go out and collect things willy-nilly. You go through this procedure that I have explained. It's systematic, it's iterative, and it's progressive. Now, at the same time, grounded theory is not a collection of codes. I've got codes, so I've got grounded theory. And it's not an analysis of themes per se. You know, what's the difference between a theme and a code? That's a hard thing to say. But codes in grounded theory tend to focus on movement, tends to focus on action and interaction. And sometimes themes can do that, yeah. But sometimes themes are much more of a static sort of thing. Now, we can get to the conceptual categories later on. Are those themes? Are those categories? It gets fuzzy later on. But grounded theory tends to get away from the notion of thematic analysis and is focused on action and interaction and social and symbolic interactions between the people. Grounded theory is not going to be able to give you a research project idea when you don't know what to do. You've got to have at least some general area of interest. It's not going to allow a person to do a PhD without having to read a lot of material. You're not going to be able to kick a tree, have 25 people fall out of a tree and tell you something, and then you get your grounded theory and get your PhD. And I know that people aren't going to like this. I don't really want to recommend it for new researchers. It takes time to develop a grounded theory. And if you haven't done any research before, you've only done just a very little bit of research, grounded theory, it has a lot of requirements for you. Now, if you haven't done research, you could sit in on ground theory studies and find out ideas of how you can maybe approach research. But it's not recommended. I would say that if you're a new researcher and you really want to do grounded theory and explore, that you go to some workshops and not just read some books, because the books on their own are kind of hard. I had to read a lot of books before I could figure out what was really happening in grounded theory methodology. Okay, some of the pros. I think it gives rigor to qualitative research. There's a case, there's the issue of, a lot of times in qualitative research, it's like, somebody's got some data, they go into a room or they go behind a curtain, someone tinkles a bell, ding-a-ling-a-ling-a-ling, and they come out and they produce this, this research, and you think, how did you do that? It's magic. Well, it's not magic with grounded theory. You can describe clearly what you've done, and a PhD supervisor can look at the students, see how are they doing their coding, how are they doing their memoing, how are they thinking, how are they connecting. It makes it very explicit so that you can study what the process is while they are thinking about the data. The theories can be powerful, and they can transform lives. I've seen people use grounded theories in that it gives them a new language to describe their situation that they didn't have before. And it helps them get a handle on what's happening in their environment. And what I would like to see, for example, as an applied linguist, works in sociolinguistics, I'd like to see applied linguists giving more to fields via grounded theory than just simply being the recipient of other feeder disciplines. I think that applied linguists, multilingual, and work with people from all over the world, have access to areas of human activity that many people don't have. But we have things that we can say, we have contributions to make. And I think that grounded theory can help us in that. But grounded theory is time consuming. It takes a lot of work, especially if you haven't done it before. It gets easier after you've done a few grounded theory projects, and it can be expensive going out and meeting people or getting the specialist software if you want to get that, getting the books, this and that and the other thing. It can be expensive, so that's something to keep in mind. Right, so as a summary, we've looked at some of the origins and early controversies. We've looked at some of the critiques, giving you an overview of the stages and procedures, and we thought about how to evaluate and to communicate a grounded theory. We've gone through a lot, and I thank you for your patience in watching and listening to this, and I suppose we will open it up now to questions, which I believe that as Dr. Kakai had said, you can send questions through the chat function, and I'll try my best.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. Excellent, excellent presentation. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, very comprehensive presentation on grounded theory method. Okay, so there are a couple of people who are raising hand. Takeo Ishiguro Sensei, would you like to share your question?
Thank you very much for your presentation. Let me turn on my video. I'm from Musashino University, and I actually do some work on grounded theories. I have done 3 projects so far.
Wow, fantastic.
Yes, and actually I wasn't raising my hand. Actually, I was clapping.
Oh.
So thank you very much for the wonderful presentations.
You're welcome.
I think most of the materials you gave today are something I have read, and I actually read your book.
Oh.
This one.
Well, thank you.
So, yes. So let me see. I wasn't ready for the question yet. I was clapping, so I maybe if somebody has a question, I'll just leave it to somebody. Yeah.
But thanks.
Thank you very much.
I can feel the love. Thanks. Thanks. Anyone else? If you have any questions, we've got about 7 minutes for questions. I think you can send it through the chat function if you feel shy, and I can look at it. I believe I'm looking at the chat function now, and I can.
Adam Sensei has a question.
Adam Sensei?
Adam
Yes.
Sensei.
Adam Komisarov. Professor Hadley, I was wondering, I really appreciate your comments earlier, distinguishing a bit between themes and the other tools of grounded theory. And you were talking about how it does get fuzzy. I was wondering if you can expand on that a little bit. I know you're going to address that perhaps later in the presentation, but if you have anything that you can enlighten us with now, that would be much appreciated.
Yeah. Definitely in the early stages of the methodology with the open coding, it's descriptive of actions. It's descriptive of as much as possible what people are doing or saying. That's the focus. And then it's in the middle level when you're starting to pare all of that down into focused codes. You still have much more action-oriented summaries of these descriptive, very descriptive codes. You're moving from very descriptive to interpretive. But then when you get to the categories, these conceptual categories, and different grounded theorists use different words for that. That's a problem. You know, those could be considered themes by some people. But grounded theorists don't like to use that language. They would like to see that more as, I don't know, an arena of human activity. You see, there's other forms of qualitative research, and they're great. I really don't want people to think that I'm advocating grounded theory as the, you know, better or, you know, or superior or the only thing that you could be doing. But the categories are still going to be aiming at what people do. Yeah. And sometimes themes are like that too. But sometimes themes can be much more static. And grounded theory tends to dislike static discussions because it draws from symbolic interactionism. They tend to limit their view of the world to what's happening and why people do that. So that's the very fuzzy distinction, I would say, between themes and coding in grounded theory. Definitely at the lower levels, looking at actions. But higher levels, yeah, it might be a theme. Somebody might call that a theme. But I would say it would be a theme of action. Maybe not a theme of concept, or a theme of emotion, of what someone's feeling on the inside. It would be much more, something of an emotional level would be more like a phenomenological approach of how they're feeling. But it would be more
people are feeling and thinking. Would you, is there space for that in grounded theory, or is it much more about action then?
Feeling is much more related to phenomenology. And people have tried to link grounded theory and phenomenology. You see some mixed versions of that. Phenomenology tends, at least the American version of phenomenology tends, if you read a good phenomenological work, you feel like you've lived inside that person. You have entered into their consciousness and you have seen the world in their eyes. And you felt their feelings. You've come out of something really significant. The grounded theory is much more connected to, for good or for real, it may be a weakness. You see what people are doing and you think, oh, okay. All right, I think I know the rules of what's happening now, and act on that. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Very interesting. Appreciate it.
Okay, time is pressing. We can take 2 more questions.
Okay.
Patrick?
Yes, Patrick, everyone can see it. Okay, so now I'm glad that coding is not so simple and can't just follow a template. Right. Think aloud. Okay, yeah. Now, for open coding, we'll just do that for a while. Think of open coding like maybe a psychoanalyst, okay, that would speak in the form of gerunds. So let's say you've got somebody sitting there and saying, oh, you know, I'm so tired, you know, I just can't sleep because I'm working like 20 hours a day, you know, and a psychoanalyst would say, so you're feeling overworked. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you're feeling, and you know, and the wife is always complaining, you know, and the kids are crying, and you know, the dog bit me. You know, you're experiencing some turmoil at home. Yeah. You see, if you try to approach your first few interviews by kind of reflecting back as if you were a counselor, then that kind of helps you with your coding. Now, you're not going to stay there. After about 5 or 10 interviews, you've gone through this process I've talked about, then you're going to be more interpretive and put some of these commonly occurring activities into, you know, more general groupings. But in the beginning, using a sort of a reflective approach to the, and you can talk aloud if you want to, helps, I found, with the coding process.
Okay, Thank you for that. That was helpful. But actually, my question was more like, in the literature, you shared a lot of books on grounded theory.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything out there that is a little bit more like somebody doing a think aloud as they go through their own project? Because grounded theory is a really complex action.
Yeah.
Almost like a craft.
Yeah.
And a lot of crafts don't have a manual. It's learned through experience, apprenticeship, and kind of direct observation. So I was wondering, is there anything out there that's kind of along that lines of watching somebody do it?
Kind of. There is that book that I mentioned by Strauss. Hang on here. The Qualitative Analysis for Social Scientists. What he does is he actually has excerpts from his class between the instructors and the students trying to work out how to code data. And so there's this conversation that goes on back and forth in it. It's really good. The book is still in print. I think it's through Cambridge University Press. And if you've got an academic link an academic resource that works, you can get the book online through Cambridge University Press. It's a qualitative, Strauss Qualitative Analysis for Social Scientists. It's 1987, but I think it might be like in its 12th reprint or something. That might help you.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that might help. Okay, well, time for one more question I see, and it's from Katalin, who's up very early in the morning. Thanks, it's over there in the UK. Can you apply GDM to non-empirical data? For example, texts. Okay, so by texts, you can write back if you need. Do you mean like archival data, or something that somebody has, an interview that of somebody from years ago? Is that what you're talking about? Is she still there? Okay, so I'm not getting anything just right now from literary texts. Yes, absolutely. Something that, and I'm glad that you asked this, because it's something that I didn't add within this, that's an important part of grounded theory analysis. Glaser spent a year abroad at the University of Paris, where he studied literature, and he studied a form of literary interpretation, which I believe, I don't know French, I think it's pronounced explication de texte, something of that nature. Textual explanation, I suppose it's the transfer, but it's more than that. But it's a way of going into the literature and, interpretively coming back and forth, understanding what's going on with it. He applied a lot of that to his open coding and his, as he called, substantive or focused coding form of grounded theory. And so that type of literary analysis and using grounded theory to analyze literature, definitely you can do that. I don't know if many people have, actually, there has been somebody who's done that. Someone by the name of Starr. Kathy Sharmas told me about someone who did something like this, where she took, maybe, was it literature? I'm not sure, but maybe it wasn't literature. Maybe it was a huge archive of data about some historical event, and developed a grounded theory about that. Anyway, sorry, the short answer is yes. Close reading. Oh, I've read a little bit on close reading, but I'm not an expert on it. I can't say.
Okay, thank you. I think it's time to close the first session.
Yes, it is.
Okay, so we'll take a short break and we'll resume at 1:15. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. I'll see you shortly.